The morning air carried the brittle coolness of late autumn, the kind that makes breath rise like smoke and leaves crunch beneath shoes. At the school gate, traffic slowed as parents ushered children toward the entrance. The air smelled faintly, of diesel from idling buses mixed with damp earth from the field beyond the fence. But what should have been a seamless start to the day had snagged on a single jarring sight. The police canine, rigid at the gate, refusing to let a teacher pass. Mr. Harlan, the teacher in question, stood frozen in a posture of awkward disbelief. He was in his late 40s, trim, the habitually neat jacket that now seemed oddly misplaced against the dog's growling stance. The German shepherd's hackles bristled, its amber eyes unblinking, front paws planted firmly across the narrow gap in the gate. The animal's chest heaved in sharp bursts, each breath clouding in the cold air. Parents who had been walking past slowed, their voices trailing into silence. Children clutched at their mothers' coats. The handler, a younger officer named Ruiz, tugged at the leash, issuing the usual calming commands, but the dog didn't yield. Its attention stayed fixed on Harlan, ears pinned forward, every muscle tense as if some silent boundary had been crossed. The growl deepened, low and steady, resonating like a distant engine under the morning noise. Ruiz muttered an apology to the teacher, his tone caught between embarrassment and concern. But the dog's refusal to move was undeniable. Harlan forced a small laugh, the kind meant to dissolve tension but landing with no warmth. "Guess he doesn't like my cologne," he said lightly, though his hands remained at his sides, fingers curling in and out. His voice was steady enough, but the humor didn't carry. A bead of sweat trickled along his temple despite the cold. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers hushed, as if some unspoken truth was gathering among them. The schoolyard itself seemed to take notice. A crow landed on the flagpole, its wings rattling the air before it settled into silence. The playground swings, abandoned for the day, swayed faintly in the wind with a faint, metallic creak. Even the students lingering near the steps seemed to sense something unusual, how the everyday rhythm of arrival had bent around this one fixed point. The dog's refusal. Ruiz crouched to eye level with the shepherd, his hand brushing its neck fur in reassurance. But the dog's body held like stone, a quiver of tension running through its stance. It wasn't mere aggression. Any trained observer could see it. This was a signal, a message in posture and focus. Something about Harlan had triggered a response, more primal than obedience, a certainty rooted in instincts far older than the schoolyard. A mother tugged her daughter closer, her face pulling. The child whispered something inaudible under the hum of waiting engines. Nearby, an older custodian paused with his broom, his lined face tightening as though he, too, recognized the difference between a startled animal and one that had locked onto a truth no one else could see. Harlan finally shifted, stepping back a half pace as though yielding without wanting to. The movement loosened the moment only slightly, but the dog pressed forward, nails scraping the concrete. A bark exploded, sharp and echoing, loud enough to bounce from the brick walls. Several children startled into tears. Ruiz jerked on the leash's jaw tightening, but the shepherd would not retreat. For the first time, Harlan's smile faltered, his lips tightening into a thin, bloodless line. His eyes flicked not at the dog but toward the gathering parents, their faces pale with unease. Whatever explanation he might have offered never left his mouth. The bell clanged for first period, its ordinary clangor now sounding strangely hollow, as if it belonged to another world. In the stillness that followed, one question hung in the air, heavier than any of the whispered ones. What had the dog sensed? The bell's echo faded, yet no one moved. Children clung tighter to their parents, caught between curiosity and the silent fear that swelled like a tide. The shepherd's growl deepened, but then something shifted. Its nose lifted, nostrils flaring in quick, sharp draws of air. It circled, once, the leash taut in Ruiz's grip, but its focus never wavered from Harlan. The teacher stood stiff, his arms now crossed against his chest, though his jaw worked as if chewing backwards. His stance looked less like patience and more like containment, as though something within him was straining against the weight of the dog's stare. A faint drizzle began to fall, soft and cool, dotting the pavement and dampening the crisp leaves. The parents at the back shuffled uneasily, their umbrellas opening with small metallic snaps, the sound breaking the fragile stillness. The rain gave the air a sheen of reflection, faces mirrored in shallow puddles, distorted and wavering, like truth's half-sea. Ruiz muttered again, firmer this time, tugging hard at the leash. But the shepherd's body stiffened, muscles rigid, and a sudden bark split the drizzle like a crack of thunder. Children flinched. A boy dropped his lunchbox, its contents scattering across the wet ground. The noise startled Harlan into stepping forward, hand out as if to prove calmness. But the dog surged, straining so violently that Ruiz's boots slid against the concrete. The leash bit into his palm, leaving raw lines in his skin. He barked a command, sharp and clipped, and for a fleeting moment, the shepherd froze, chest heaving, breath steaming in the rain. Harlan's outstretched hand lingered midair, shaking slightly. Then, as if sensing the gaze of too many eyes, he let it fall and cleared his throat. The drizzle had settled into a steady mist, dampening his jacket until the shoulders darkened. His voice when it came was thin. "Perhaps it's best if I come back later." But no step followed, no turn toward departure. He remained by the gate, suspended as though leaving would confirm something he dared not reveal. From the field beyond the fence came a sudden sound, a crow, startled from the wet grass, beating its wings in a ragged flight. The shepherd's ears flicked toward it, then back, torn between instinctive distraction and the command of its senses. Ruiz caught the shift and pressed the leash down, steadying the animal against his leg. For a heartbeat, the air seemed to loosen. Children were urged forward, shuffling past, shoulders hunched against the drizzle, but they did not run. They walked in the careful, sideways manner of creatures passing a predator they did not wish to provoke. The custodian, broom still in hand, stepped closer. His boots splashed in shallow puddles, his old eyes sharp under the rim of his cap. He said nothing, but his glance moved between the shepherd, the handler, and Harlan with quiet calculation. When the dog barked again, he flinched it from fear, but recognition. There was something familiar in that insistence, an echo of a warning he had seen once before, long ago, when his neighbor's dog refused to enter a barn that later collapsed. His fingers tightened on the broom handle. Ruiz finally spoke, his tone controlled but taut. "Sir, I'll need you to stay outside the gate for now." Harlan's lips parted as though to argue, but his voice did not come. Instead, he glanced around at the circle of watching faces. Parents shifted uneasily, eyes avoiding his. The drizzle beaded on his lashes, blurring his gaze into something unreadable. Still, he did not leave. Then came the smallest of moments, one that bent the mood further. A child, no more than 6, dropped a red mitten into a puddle near Harlan's feet. She hesitated, a tiny hand outstretched, eyes flicking between him and the growling shepherd. Harlan bent, swift and stiff, to pick it up. The instant his fingers touched the fabric, the dog lunged not to bite, but to slam against the leash, barking with such force that the sound rattled the metal gate. The child screamed, yanked back into her mother's arms. The mitten slipped from Harlan's hand, sodden and dark against the pavement. The rain fell harder. Ruiz braced, holding the shepherd back with both hands, muscles straining against the dog's raw insistence. The leash groaned under the pull. Its leather stretched, but it held. For the first time, Ruiz's own face showed unease, not at the dog's defiance, but at the clarity of its refusal. Whatever it sensed was not fading. The custodian stooped to pick up the mitten himself. When he straightened, he met Harlan's eyes for a moment longer than was polite. What passed between them was not anger nor accusation, but a weight, something unsaid, yet heavy enough to leave the air colder than the rain. A distant siren rose, thin at first, then growing louder, cutting through drizzle and hushed whispers. Whether it was coincidence or consequence, no one at the gate could tell. The shepherd's stilled ears pricked toward the sound, but its body remained tense, ready. Harlan exhaled once, sharp through his nose, and stepped back from the gate. Yet even as he did, he made no move to leave. The siren drew closer. Parents tightened their grip on their children. And in that narrowed silence, the question deepened, not just what the dog had sensed, but why Harlan refused to walk away. The morning had thickened into a hush, the kind that falls over a place when too many eyes are fixed on one point. The canine had not relented. Its weight leaned forward, leash taut, the muscles along its back trembling with restrained force. Ruiz's knuckles whitened as he kept his grip, but the shepherd's gaze never left the teacher, as though something unseen bound them both in place. Harlan adjusted his jacket collar with a stiff hand. His mouth formed a smile that never reached his eyes, the kind of expression a man uses when he knows he is being watched. The parents remained in a cluster just beyond the gate, their murmurs fragile as if they were afraid of drawing the dog's attention onto themselves. Even the children had gone unusually quiet, their backpacks dangling, their sneakers still on the pavement. The normal bustle of a school morning had congealed into a tableau of waiting. Then the wind shifted. It was a small thing, a passing draft that carried with it the sour tang of diesel from the buses, but also something sharper, metallic, like iron warmed in the sun. The dog's growl rose at once, the sound no longer steady but guttural, breaking into barks that ricocheted off the brick walls. Ruiz pulled back with force, boots scraping across concrete, but the shepherd surged toward Harlan, claws sparking against the pavement. The reaction rippled outward. A boy dropped his lunchbox with a hollow thud. A mother yanked her child by the arm, nearly stumbling. A teacher who had been stepping out from the office doorway froze, her hand clamped around the frame. For an instant, it felt as if the entire schoolyard might collapse into chaos, the tension snapping into panic. But then something shifted, not in the dog, but in the teacher. Harlan's composure cracked, not in words, but in the quickness of his retreat. He stepped back 2-3 paces, eyes darting not at the dog but at the ground, then toward the small administrative office near the gate. His face, drawn tight with restraint, betrayed a flicker of something unguarded fear or recognition. The shepherd's frenzy seemed to mirror that flash, as though confirming some silent exchange only the animal understood. The crow that had been perched on the flagpole launched suddenly into flight, its wings slicing the air with a coarse cry. Shadows bent across the yard as clouds thickened overhead, dimming the brittle sunlight. Ruiz cursed under his breath, struggling to wrest control, his uniform dampening with sweat despite the chill. He pressed a knee forward, commanding the dog down. But the shepherd ignored him entirely, nose stretched high, nostrils working in sharp pulls. Whatever it had caught in the wind was more urgent than any human authority. The parents' murmurs grew louder now, threading with unease. "What's wrong with him?" one whispered. Another shook her head, clutching her handbag to her chest as though something might spill from it. It was not fear of the dog that bound them, but the possibility that the dog had uncovered something none of them could yet see. And then, just as suddenly, the shepherd fell silent. Its barks cut off mid-breath, leaving only the rattle of leaves and the distant cough of a bus engine. The dog stood rigid, ears pricked, nose turned not at Harlan anymore, but toward the small storage building behind the fence line, a squat, windowless shed often ignored in the rush of mornings, its entire body aimed at that place, as if a compass had swung to reveal a truer north. Harlan exhaled sharply, his chest rising as though released from invisible hands, but instead of stepping forward into the schoolyard, he turned half away, gaze locking on that shed. His lips parted, then closed again, the faintest tremor working through his jaw. Ruiz, catching the direction of the dog's stare, followed it too, confusion drawing lines across his brow. The yard itself seemed to listen. The branches of the oak swayed, their rustle echoing like a restless whisper. The swing chains clinked, faintly stirred by the same wind that had shifted the dog's senses. Even the children seemed to know they were no longer watching a quarrel between man and animal, but the pointing of a finger none of them wanted to see. Ruiz steadied himself, tugging the leash taut. The shepherd did not resist this time but stood, fixed, tail stiff, gaze burning toward that forgotten shed. The officer swallowed, the sound audible in the silence. Then, without lifting his eyes from the place, he said in a voice lower than before, "Stay here." He guided the dog forward a few paces, away from the teacher, toward the gate's edge. The shepherd followed willingly, muscles coiled with anticipation. Behind them the crowd pressed tighter, instinctively silent now, every breath held, and in the brief pause, in the space between movement and revelation, one truth settled heavy across the yard. Whatever had begun at the gate was not about Cologne, not about temperament, not even about Harlan. It was about that building, ordinary, unremarkable, and now suddenly, the center of everything. The bell rang again, a hollow clang through the stillness. But no one moved toward the classrooms. The playground had emptied into classrooms, but the gate still held its quiet standoff. The canine's breath came in short bursts, mist curling from its muzzle as its weight pressed low against the leash. Ruiz's gloved hand strained, the taut leather strap humming under tension. Harlan had not moved, except for the tightening of his jaw, the subtle hunch of his shoulders as if weathering invisible weight. The silence around them deepened until the scrape of a lone oak branch against the school fence filled the space with a restless whisper. Then something shifted, not with the teacher or the dog, but with the parents. One father who had lingered at the curb stepped forward, his eyes narrowed not at the shepherd but at Harlan. His daughter's backpack strap was looped around his wrist, her lunchbox swinging in nervous rhythm against his leg. The child tugged, once at his sleeve, but he did not look down. The man's stare held steady, as though the dog's behavior had voiced a suspicion already waiting in him. A murmur passed through the group, faint and rippling, like reeds stirring along the edge of a pond. Ruiz finally gave the command for the shepherd to stand down. Voice clipped and firm. For a moment, it seemed the dog would obey. Its body eased upward, but instead of retreating it pivoted suddenly, lunging nose first at the ground near Harlan's shoe. The bark that followed was different, short, insistent, not threat but alarm. Ruiz crouched quickly, one hand at the harness, eyes narrowing at the spot where the dog's paw scraped against gravel. There, almost hidden in the grit, was a sliver of torn fabric, pale and frayed, clinging to the chain of the gate. Harlan's eyes darted down, then away, his face hardening with an effort at composure. The fabric meant little to anyone else, but Ruiz's pause lengthened. A trace of unease ran over the parents. They didn't know why this mattered, but they knew enough about working dogs to understand that such fixation was rarely meaningless. The shepherd pressed its nose hard to the gate again, the low rumble in its throat returning. This was not random stubbornness, it was tracking. Parents exchanged glances, and certainty mingled with the primal discomfort of watching. Instinct outpaced explanation. Harlan lifted his hand at last, running his palm across his temple as though wiping away sweat, though the air was cool. "This is absurd," he said quietly, not loud enough for the children inside the classrooms to hear. His posture had shifted now, no longer simply inconvenienced but drawn tight, as if bracing for a wave that had not yet broken. Above them, the crow that had lingered since morning rattled its wings and took flight, its call rasping across the schoolyard. The sound seemed to jar the group from stillness, but the spell wasn't broken, only deepened. Ruiz stood, the strip of fabric pinched between his gloved fingers. His expression was unreadable, but his silence carried more weight than words. The shepherd pressed again toward Harlan, tail stiff, ears sharpened forward. This time Ruiz didn't command it back. The officer's stance shifted subtly, feet braced as if he too had crossed into new territory without meaning to. The drizzle began without warning, a thin sheet of rain whispering across the asphalt, softening edges and muting the world. Parents pulled jackets close, umbrellas bloomed, but no one left. They were tethered to the scene as firmly as Ruiz was tethered to his dog. The fabric in his hand darkened with water, but he kept it raised, his eyes flicking once more toward Harlan, and in that moment the quiet balance tilted. Harlan stepped back not far, just enough for the shepherd to surge forward, nails screeching against wet concrete, teeth bared not at random but at a single, unwavering target. Ruiz's grip tightened, the leash snapped taut. A gasp rose from the parents, some pulling their children closer, others simply frozen in place. Harlan's shoes slipped on the damp ground, and though he caught himself, the stumble was enough. His neat posture broke, and for a heartbeat his expression, unguarded, showed something raw, not anger, not annoyance, but a flicker of dread, as if the dog's silent accusation had found its mark. The drizzle thickened into rain, pattering against the tin roof of the bike racks, dripping down the gate hinges, masking the tremor in the breaths of those who watched. Ruiz straightened slowly, his body angled not toward the dog now but toward the man standing on the other side of the gate. The shepherd growled, low and constant, as if time itself had narrowed to this one sound. No word was spoken, but in that pause, irreversible as it was quiet, the morning's order had shifted. The bell had already rung. The children were inside, yet the adults remained outside the gate, held by something heavier than rain. What had begun as an inconvenience now pressed into something else, something not yet named, and when Ruiz finally pocketed the fabric scrap, his silence was louder than any command. Rain continued to patter softly against the gate, each drop carrying with it the quiet weight of what had just passed. Ruiz's hand still gripped the leash, though the shepherd had eased into a steady stance, its chest rising and falling with a calmer rhythm now. The growl had faded, replaced by something quieter watchfulness. Harlan stood with his back slightly turned, not in defiance but in surrender to a truth that no one had wanted to name aloud. The scrap of fabric in Ruiz's pocket was no longer just cloth. It was a symbol, a small shard of something hidden too long, now brought into daylight. By instinct alone, no one spoke, because words were no longer needed. Parents, huddled under umbrellas, began to drift apart, yet their faces held the same expression, a weary understanding that whatever had been exposed was larger than any single morning at a school gate. It was not drama that lingered, but a quiet shift in perception, as though a veil had lifted. The shepherd, with its simple refusal to step aside, had forced people to see what they had chosen not to look for before. Ruiz bent to steady the dog, his palm brushing over damp fur. He did not praise it with the cheerful voice handlers often used. Instead, he simply placed a hand at its neck and let it feel his stillness. The shepherd's ears twitched, then lowered, body softening as if it too understood the work was finished. It had not been aggression, not defiance. It was a message given in the only language it knew. Loyalty had demanded it. Harlan shifted once more, and in that motion there was no anger left. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in the way a man concedes to inevitability. Whatever the parents whispered among themselves no longer mattered. His silence was its own confession, though it carried less spectacle than sorrow, less outrage than resignation. The shepherd had not uncovered a crime with fangs or a chase, but it had revealed the faint line between trust and doubt, and once drawn, that line could not be erased. The drizzle softened and mist, the kind that clings to the skin without sound. The crow returned, gliding low across the playground before vanishing into the dark arms of the oak. The swings, left alone, moved only with the rhythm of the rain. Inside, unseen but present, children's voices rose faintly, muffled behind the walls of the school. Their laughter had not stopped, because the innocence of their day had not been broken. Only the adults remained changed. Ruiz exhaled, long and steady, the sound nearly lost in the rainfall. He loosened his grip on the leash, letting the shepherd take a step back. The dog's posture softened fully now, tail lowered, gaze no longer fixed on the man but drifting across the empty schoolyard, ears flicking at distant noises. It was an animal once more, not an instrument of confrontation but simply itself, bound by training yet ruled by something more ancient. In that soft return to calm, a lesson became clear not through words or revelation, but through the way the shepherd carried itself. Truth had not arrived in shouts or judgments but in quiet insistence, in the steady refusal to let what was wrong go unnoticed. It was not about punishment or spectacle, but about the cost of trust and the responsibility of guarding it. As the last of the parents departed, Ruiz remained a while longer by the gate. Harlan had already walked away, his steps slow, each one echoing heavier than the last. The shepherd shook once, droplets scattering into the air, then sat in stillness, eyes scanning the horizon as if waiting for nothing in particular. The morning, was broken open, yet it closed again with the quiet dignity of rain dissolving into earth. By the time Ruiz finally led the dog back toward the patrol car, the mist had thickened into a silver veil across the fields. The shepherd glanced once over its shoulder, not at the gate or the crowd that had gathered, but at the place where it had stood its ground. The paw prints it left behind filled slowly with water, blurring until they merged with the wet concrete, as though the morning itself wished to erase the evidence but not the memory.